afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Back? Okay, fine. This is for people who haven't heard it before, and for those with such poor memory, they forgot that they've already heard it. So everybody's welcome. A little bit of serendipity. I got into the space program and other things with serendipity, being lucky, being in the right place at the right time. I originally started out thinking I was going to be a professional musician, playing violin when I was 4, and I've got a photograph there of me in the Lord Fauntleroy suit when I was with the Wurlitzer Baby Orchestra. We got kicked out when we were 6 years old. And I had the Carnegie Hall program. Eventually I turned down a scholarship at Juilliard because I decided music is a great avocation, but it's a tough vocation. So the violin became fiddling into square dancing, and I decided I was going to be an engineer. Serendipity, engineering. When I was doing my graduate work at University of Michigan, they had people come in to interview for jobs. And one of the people who came to interview me was an alumnus of Michigan, and he was the head of the communications section, head of the communication department actually, of the Signal Corps Research and Development Labs.
Turn it up.
Turn it up. Sure.
Yep.
I'll have to wait till I see somebody when Victor comes around. He can adjust it for me. Anyway, he interviewed me, and serendipity, he happened to be there. He happened to be from the Signal Corps. He happened to be an alumnus of Michigan, and essentially he hired me on the spot to work in the radio relay section of the Signal Corps. That's how they got signals from one end to the earth to the other. They'd shoot it up, and they bounce it off the section of the atmosphere called the troposphere, fixed layer, and they would send the radio signals up, have them bounce down again, and up, down, up, down, up, down, and I get the signal across. That's what was called radio relay. So I worked there until I got drafted, and then went back to work for them. And while I was in the Army, I also started the U.S. Army official helicopter square dance team. We wanted to show the mobility of helicopters in wartime. So we had 4 helicopters dressed up like men and women, 75 feet off the ground, painted eyes on them and stuff, and from the ground to the audience I'd say, do-si-do, and the helicopters would go around each other like that. And it was to show the mobility of helicopters during warfare. And we got onto the Dave Garroway show, and helicopter square dance practice got me out of KP. So, it became a big thing. If you Google dancing helicopters or square dancing helicopters, it's now a major event across the country. So much for that. Now back to the space program. It started 60 years ago in October of '57. And you probably all remember that Russia sent something called Sputnik up into space. That was the first space object, first space satellite. It took the United States totally by shock, by surprise. We had no intelligence, no inkling, no nothing that this was going to happen. And shortly after that, that particular one only stayed up in the air for 96 minutes. And 3 months, it burned out and went back into the ground. It ignited and went down to the ground and burned. At the time, I was still working as a civilian engineer for the Signal Corps. And after Sputnik, 1 week after Sputnik, I sent a memo. We didn't have email then. I sent a letter to the commanding general of Fort Monmouth. I don't know how I got the nerve to do that, but I did. And I said, why does the U.S. not have their own space electronics program? It was done in the country. And the memo came back from the general to the colonel to the captain to the lieutenant to the sergeant to the corporal. And I finally got this message from the general, and all it said was, do it. That was how the space program started. And I gathered a team of 7 electrical and mechanical engineers, and we started to design the first communication satellite. It was weird. I always looked younger than I am, and at the time, when we were getting the first satellite going, I was 28 years old, but the equivalent of it, we call it GS-15, which is like a full colonel, and I would meet with congressional people and senators and generals, and I looked like a little kid. And in fact, I took some of them to a restaurant, and I was carded. So it was very embarrassing. Anyway, in June of '58, which is just 8 months after Sputnik, and 1 month before NASA was formed, that I actually started this group. NASA was formed 1 month later. There were no reference books. We didn't have computers. We didn't have Google. We didn't have anything. We didn't even know what we were doing. No calculators. I know some of you may remember a slide rule. That's what all my calculations were, on a slide rule. And we had no idea how things were going to work in space. It's interesting that the first reference to space satellite, communication satellite, was by Arthur C. Clarke. I don't know if any of you know Arthur C. Clarke, but he was a technical consultant in 2001, wrote many science fiction stories, and he sent me this book, and in it, he wrote, back in 1945, while I was a radar officer in the Royal Air Force, I had the only original idea of my life. 12 years before Sputnik started to beep, it occurred to me that an artificial satellite would be a wonderful place for a television transmitter. Since a station several thousand miles high could broadcast to half the globe. So this was the first written idea. I take it back, it wasn't the first written one. There's another one about to the moon. That was by Jules Verne, wrote To the Earth to the Moon. Well, we started to design this communication satellite. Somehow, word reached the White House. And from President Eisenhower and his staff on down, they decided this would make an incredible impact on the world if he could have his voice up in space transmitting down to the world as the first voice message transmitted from space. And they contacted us and said that we have 6 months to design the satellite. This is the first one we ever did. We had no knowledge of what we were doing. We had 6 months to do it. And President Eisenhower said that if word leaked out, even 1 day beforehand, he would abort the mission, because he said the negative propaganda throughout the world would be so bad that Russia was successful with Sputnik, and here the U.S. tried something and it failed. So he said he would abort it at the last minute. The payload was, I'll show you some of the things. This is a prototype from our lab, 57, and this was the power supply, a copy of the power supply that was in the satellite. Today, with today's miniaturization, instead of this, it would be the size of about half your thumb for the same thing. And this pink stuff, you know how when they build a house, they pour this foam in between the walls that hardens up and thickens for insulation? Well, we said, okay, we better put some of that around here because I'm not sure how it would work in space. And in fact, in the satellite, we built 2 of everything because we weren't sure what was going to go wrong. 2 recorders, 2 power supplies, 2 everything. And sure enough, one of the tape recorders with Eisenhower's message on it failed. So I'm very glad we put in the second one. These are prototypes of the original solar cells 6 months after they were developed by Bell Laboratories. They are now so much more efficient, but these are the original ones, and basically copies of this was on the satellite. Now at the time, even the rocketry was in its infancy. We didn't know about ejecting nose cones and things like that. So the entire Atlas missile, 9,000 pounds of missile, was the satellite itself. And we crammed the electronics into the nose cone of the Atlas missile. And the batteries only lasted for a little bit less than 2 weeks before, and the thing was in orbit for about a month before it came and burned down, but we only had 12 days of battery operation for the whole thing to work. The program was called SCORE, and the government loved these anagrams where you make up letters, words to fit the things. So this is called SCORE, Signal Communication by Orbiting Relay Equipment. And 2 years later, I designed the electronics for the first weather satellite, and that was called TIROS, which stood for TV Infrared Observation Satellite. The government loved acronyms, and the only one they had trouble with was the anti-satellite satellite. Oh, you figured it out. The cameras in the weather satellite were nothing like those now in Google Maps. I'll show you. These will all be on the table, so you can hold them up and look at them later. But this particular one, for example, is Florida. And when you look at it closely, you can actually see the shape of Florida. And this was the best that our cameras could do. This was taken from about 400 miles up in space. Today, with the cameras that you get, you can not only see the outline of Florida, you can not only see Key West, but you can see the restaurant that Hemingway ate in Key West. And here's one with the Suez Canal, the Nile River, and the Red Sea, and one on the coast of Africa. And I will leave these on the table for you to look at later. I did write one book on the subject called Introduction to Space Communications. We sold more copies in Russia than we did in the United States. Let me take a break and do a quick Blue Book cruise questionnaire. Yell out the answer if you know it quickly. The first human in space. Yuri Gagarin, right? The first American in space. Alan Shepard. He was a womanizer. The first American to orbit the Earth. John Glenn. The first person to walk in space. No, that's the first American. It was a Russian cosmonaut. The Russian cosmonaut walked in space 4 years before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. The first woman astronaut, Sally Ride. She actually died in 2012, age 53, from an explosion. How long will it take a rocket to go from the Earth to Mars? The answer is 9 months. How long will it take an email to reach Mars, or a voicemail? The answer is 20 minutes. So, in those science fiction movies that you see, in the Star Wars thing, where they're talking back and forth to Earth, that's not technically correct, because it doesn't go that long. In fact, even on Earth, it takes 5 seconds for sound to travel 1 mile. That's why you hear the lightning, you see the lightning, and then later you hear it, because it takes a while for the sound to reach you. In fact, that's how you can sometimes tell how far away the lightning was. When you hear the lightning, you can count 1, 2, number of seconds, and you can figure out how far the distance was. What else do I want to... That's not enough people. That's enough for the quiz. Let's get back to the main event. Another major event in 1960 was bouncing signals off the moon. And this is just getting, and to practice that first, we developed what we called sounding rockets. These rockets were maybe up to the height of the ceiling, a little bit more maybe, and they were only about this big around. And we put in it, I'll show you, this material. It's virtually indestructible. And what they did is they used this luminized mylar and made a 100-foot sphere out of it. You can visualize the size of that. And inside the sphere was a powder that when the sounding rocket got up into the vacuuming less air up there, the powder would evaporate, and the evaporation of the powder would blow the balloon up. So, and it was called Project Echo, because they were going to bounce signals off this. Echo, obviously. The very first sounding rocket that we sent up started out perfectly. The rocket went up, the nose cone opened, the balloon came out, and the rest of the rocket kept on going, one hole in and one hole out. Then we said, hey, we should have canted the nose cone sideways, so that didn't happen. I'll leave this here, and you're welcome to try to break it or rip it or whatever before. No one has done it yet, someone still may. But there are other goofs. Some of these I found in the magazine. In 1997, the European Space Agency wanted to measure winds on one of the moons of Saturn, and they launched the rocket and waited for the data to come back. After nothing happened, they finally realized they forgot to turn the power on the receiver inside the satellite. In 2004, a NASA probe was returning to Earth. They collected a bunch of material, some solar particles, and they were supposed to trigger 2 parachutes so the thing could come down gently. But it didn't. It slammed into a desert in Utah. It turned out the deceleration sensors were installed upside down. Oh, so these are rocket scientists. Astronomers in Australia used a radio telescope, and they sat there listening, hoping for sounds from outer space. 17 years later, after they heard sounds what they thought was alien life, they found the signals came from a microwave oven used by the staff to heat up their lunches. And I don't know whether this is true or not, but I've heard that NASA spent billions on a pen that could write upside, downside, in a vacuum, underwater, whatever, and the Russians just use pencils. Okay, back to reality. One other thing with myself, I inadvertently flushed my top secret badge down the toilet. And there was a lot of paperwork to fill out, quadruple it or something. And finally, we decided on words just saying that it was irretrievably lost. I wrote my book in 1963, and the problem was the incredible speed of technology. When I was writing chapter 5, what I wrote in chapter 2 was already obsolete. The last chapter of my book, which I put out there, I don't understand it anymore. There are too many formulas. But the last chapter of the book is called Ad Astra, in Latin meaning to the stars. And I tried to forecast what would happen. In 10 years. And everything I wrote pretty much was done within less than that. Then I wrote about radiation-resistant tape and clothing which changes temperature with color, and self-repairing computers, micro-miniaturization, extraterrestrial communications. People ask me, do I believe there's life outside of Earth elsewhere? And my honest answer is I do not know. The Earth is one of billions of stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way. And there are billions of galaxies. So someplace on there probably is something or some things that are, quote, life. But we have no idea if there is, what form it would take, how it could be identified. So it's still just a big mystery. A few tidbits about the moon. Before that, I think of one thing in Japan. While I was at the Signal Corps, I sent an unsolicited article to the Japanese Rocket Society. My boss didn't know that I sent that in. And it got approved. So I tried to slip through the travel requisition, and it didn't slip. My boss, who was head of the technical group there, said in his European accent, "George, very good paper, but if anybody goes to Japan to present it, me, not you." So he did go to Japan, and he read my paper. A few moon tidbits. The moon is about 1/4 of the Earth's diameter. It's our only natural satellite, obviously. And the moon is about 250,000 miles from the Earth. It looks like it's standing still, but it's not. The moon is actually moving at 2/3 of a mile every second. Hard to believe. And this will also be the basis of what I talk next about, which are the satellites that transmit your TV, your GPS, your smartphones, etc. When you're in a car or a train and there's another car or a train next to you and they're traveling at the same speed that you are, you look out the window, it looks like they're not moving. So the same thing here. If you take a satellite, the right height, and the satellite is orbiting very fast at the same equivalent of the Earth, it looks to us like it's standing still. And that was a development of what they call the first geostationary satellite. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. The Earth is supposedly getting a little bit heavier every year from space dust falling and accumulating. And the moon supposedly is moving away about 2 inches every year. The gravity on the moon is so low, that's why you see, when you see the pictures, you see them sort of hopping up and down on the moon, because the gravity is only 17% of what that is on Earth. My experience with the moon was on a secret project with Dr. Werner von Braun. Some of you may have heard of him. Von Braun was a German scientist brought over with some other German scientists in 1959 on something called Operation Paperclip. He actually became a citizen later, and he was in charge of a top secret program where they were going to build a communication station on the moon. They assembled the team for the engineering part, for the electronics, of 13 people around the country. In serendipity, I was one of the 13 to work with von Braun. He was a very stoic European. He had very little sense of humor, and he hated having to go to Washington to plead for money for NASA. He very apolitical. So we started to work on this ultra secret program to do a moon station, and the project was just declassified 2 years ago, and I read about it on Wikipedia. And you won't believe this, but the government lied to me. They told me it was a communication station so we could better transmit and get signals back and forth to the planets and everything. Not true. It turns out that it was going to be a military station with nuclear capability, manned by 6 astronauts on a permanent basis. So the project was eventually canceled. It never got going. But because it was top secret, we could not tell our family or our boss. They didn't have a need to know. And most of the work was down in Huntsville, Alabama, where von Braun was headquartered. And I would get tickets for Washington, D.C., and my wife would say, in the salon and at the airport, I would get the tickets changed from Washington to Huntsville. And she would call up and say, Mr. George, how are things in Washington? And I'd make up something. The rose blossoms are beautiful. And in Huntsville, tidbit of information, Huntsville was once the watercress capital of the world. You can add that to the important tidbits of knowledge. One of the comments that von Braun made to me was that he got a lot of his ideas for rockets from reading science fiction books, which you don't have to be a rocket scientist to be a rocket scientist. Jules Verne's, I mentioned before, wrote about the first moon landing in his book, From the Earth to the Moon. That was 150 years ago. The first human, as we said before, to orbit the Earth, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, 56 years ago. 1 month later is when Alan Shepard went up to Earth, went up to the moon, but he didn't go around. He didn't say up and down. President Kennedy in 1962 said this famous broadcast to the world, and Kennedy said, "We are second to the Soviets in long-range boosters. I've said from the beginning, we started late, we've been behind, we'll be behind for a while, but I believe that before the end of this decade is out, the U.S. will be ahead." And we weren't. Well, NASA launched its first geostationary satellite, the one that I talked about, where it looks like it's standing still. And it looks like it's standing still if the satellite is 22,300 miles above the Earth. And from there, if you did a thing like this, it would cover about 1/3 of the Earth. So in theory, 3 of those stations could cover the entire Earth. Now there are hundreds of them up there. China has an active space program. India, many countries now have put up rockets and satellites for various purposes. The very first telecast using these stationary satellites were to broadcast the Summer Olympics from Tokyo in 1964. But now there are all kinds of peaceful as well as military applications. And this all started from this little communication satellite project that I did 60 years ago. My last project in the space program was on the Apollo. The famous one was Apollo 11 in 69. That's when Aldrin and Neil Armstrong did the walk on the moon. They didn't publish the fact, but there was less than 30 seconds of fuel left in a lunar module when it landed on the moon. 6 hours later was when Neil Armstrong took that famous giant leap for all mankind. And they left a plaque on the surface of the moon, and the plaque reads, "Here, men from planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969. We came in peace for all mankind." The final Apollo mission was in 1972. The project that I was program manager of was the fuel gauging system for Apollo for the command module. That's where the astronauts actually were. So we had to design the fuel mixture and gauging system on that command module. At times, the worst of it was one time when we went 80 hours in a row without sleep. Just a few cat naps, just so we could beat the deadline. And it turned out that our group was, I think, the only one that was both under budget, under schedule, and I got the only bonus issued by NASA that year. Very nice. All told, there are 24 astronauts that have flown to the moon or around the moon, but only 12 of those actually got their feet on the moon. I'll tell you a story. Gordon Cooper, one of the original 7 astronauts, brought back from the moon a dehydrated, condensed oatmeal cookie. It looked like a large dice, and he gave me that as a souvenir. And one Thanksgiving dinner, we had around 10 people around the table, and my father was 2 places over to the right, and he was hard of hearing in his left ear, and he didn't hear what I was saying. And the thing came around to my father. He said, "Oh, thanks," popped it in his mouth, and never to be seen again. It's funny now. It was not funny then. I don't know how many of you know Whizzer Wheeler, one of our residents here, who worked also on the space program. He told me another story about Scott Carpenter. And where Whizzer worked, they did analysis of various bodily fluids on the astronauts. And there were globules of this bodily fluid floating in space. So they had to capture and collect globules one by one. Things happened. It was messy. So NASA's mission was to demonstrate that peaceful activities really can exist for all mankind develop space activities, study potential benefits, science, and billions more were spent for military purposes, reconnaissance, countermeasures, propaganda, politics. But there are many peaceful uses that we just take for granted now. Storm warnings, mapping inaccessible areas like jungles, helping farmers, meteorology. You all watch the news reports, newsreels, your weather reporters, and there were all these photos of space, astronomy, scientific. Sooner or later, maybe colonizing the moon. And I think that your children have a high probability of seeing men on Mars. It's a high probability. They're also investigating Jupiter, where they thought they found water. Although now they're complaining the water they thought on Mars might really be sand. But they're studying this. You can find solar cells now on everything. Toys, traffic lights, calculators, everything. They're ubiquitous. They're all over the place. Other benefits: improved medical technology, disease diagnosis, specialized equipment, how to grow tissues in a vacuum. Now, astronauts lose bone strength, they have balance problems, etc. So, P.S., make sure you go to Brenda and Angela's classes on balance and exercise. Very important. So the Apollo program also created micro-miniature electronics, microwave ovens, the cookingware that go directly from the oven into the freezer or vice versa. In fact, the early nose cones were made of a certain kind of ceramic, and to those of you who might remember, there's something called pyroceram, and that was pottery that could withstand incredible heat, and that was developed as a result of this, as well as diamond drills for the dentist. I might point out that the scientists recently did identify, as Scott Kelly, a fungus that was growing in between his toes. And it's appropriate to mention this around New Year's season because they named this mistletoe. Sorry. Anyway, it's ironic that the U.S. got into the space program in competition with Russia. Now there have been many joint projects together with Russia where transmitting people and cargo. NASA has started outsourcing space missions to private companies. Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, etc. Flights will be available to the public at some time, and with economy seats for about $100,000. The U.S. is currently exploring the idea of sending humans, of sending an orbit to the asteroid belt in 2025. That's like just 8 years away. I'm now going to play the tape that was made by President Eisenhower. The tape is 3.5 minutes long. There are 3 parts to the tape. Part 1 is a description of Project Explorer itself. And that was made in a slightly noisy environment, but you'll be able to understand most of it. Part 2 of the tape is Eisenhower's voice actually being transmitted from space as we recorded it on the ground. And it's very staticky because this was all very rudimentary that we did. And the third part of the tape, and the whole thing only 3.5 minutes, I said, the third part of the tape is the actual recording of President Eisenhower in the studio where he was making the recording for space. And that's absolutely perfectly clear. So I'm going to play that recording now.
The following is a copy of the original message transmitted from the Atlas satellite communication system. This message was received at Cape Canaveral, Florida on December the 19th, 1958 by members of the Transmission Facilities Division, Communications Department airborne portion of the system was fortunate enough to be in position to recover the stored message from the orbiting Atlas missile the following day. Following this initial interrogation, the full capability of the airborne portion of the system to receive, store, and play back both voice and teletype messages on command was proven feasible at each of the 4 ground communication terminals located at Fort MacArthur, California, Fort Huachuca, Arizona, Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and Fort Stewart, Georgia. The next voice you will hear is that of the President of the United States in his Christmas message to the world, speaking from outer space.
The recording you will now hear is the original recording of the President's message before it was put into the satellite.
This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space. My message is a simple one. Through this unique means, I convey to you and to all mankind America's wish for peace on earth and goodwill toward men everywhere.
What's interesting is on the day of the launch, President Eisenhower had scheduled at the White House, coincidentally, a delegation from the Soviet-controlled Poland. At the White House dinner that evening, the President was informed of the success of the launch, at which point he interrupted the dinner and revealed the existence of the project because it was held top secret. His announcement described that although the score was a peaceful mission, the United States now had the capability of delivering a nuclear weapon from space. To this day, when I see the moon, I literally stare at it and think that 38 years ago there were people walking up and down on it and picking up rocks. And it's just truly amazing. I'm glad to have been part of the space revolution. After the talk, you're welcome to look at these. I'll be happy to take questions, and thank you all for coming. You're welcome to help yourself and look at the memorabilia. You can try to rip the Mylar. I don't think you'll be successful, but you can certainly try it. And anybody has any questions, fine. If not, thank you.
George, when
Yep.
you retired, what did you do?
What?
When you retired, what did you do?
I haven't retired. When I retired, I called swearing answers and taught business courses.
Oh, fine.
But I really didn't retire until this year.
That's great.
I still do some consulting.